Before I get into the conversation piece with this video, I just want to tell you guys that a handful of days ago I was invited onto Charlie Looker's podcast called The Last Things. And for a solid 90 minutes we talked about metal and music, but also he asked me about what are my thought process and procedures with my YouTube channel as a whole, along with other forms of really engaging conversation that for me it was a lot of fun to do. And even though it went on for 90 minutes, I felt like the flow of it was very smoothly, as there was no drag out points with it. Again, just a lot of engagement that was fun, and I really enjoyed the end results of it. So I have a link provided in the description to where you can watch that in its entirety, and I would also recommend subscribing to Charlie Looker's channel if you enjoy extreme metal and other forms of experimental music. So I figured it's only fair that if last week I talked about everything I dislike about metal, that the follow-up video should be everything I like about metal. And again, keep this in mind, this isn't necessarily all the bands and the sounds of it per se that I'm talking about. It's just my overall biased takes, which again, keep in mind I don't expect you guys to agree with me with everything I'm about to say here, but my biased takes about what you'll find in terms of the characteristics and scene within metal that I really enjoy about it, and I think it's a huge reason as to why I've been so attached to metal music and its just subculture for the past decade of my life. First and foremost, one thing you will find in metal is dedication. While I'm aware that the word dedication is not just exclusive to metal music, metal makes it very known that they are proud of having dedication with their sound. Take for example any of the big names that come to mind that were formed around the 70s or 80s. And while a handful of them are still active today, touring and even releasing new music, what they've been able to do has made such an impact of inspiration for countless musicians and bands throughout the world. And with the after effects of that, it's going to create so many other bands for future generations to enjoy, that even though metal has been around for, God, over half a century at this point, it never really feels like it's going to fizzle out or fade away even in the slightest, in the fan base anyway, that I feel like I can invest my time with this music and it's always going to be there. Its overall sound and just energy carried over for decades now. And while some may say that's redundant, it's oversaturated, nothing really new is coming out of this particular sound, yes, you can argue that. Again, the one strong feature you have with it, and I feel like it's as to why so many metal fans are just so diehard for it, is you have reliability. And I feel like that's a strong thing to have when talking about a scene or a community of any kind. Look at a band like Blood Incantation, and regardless if you think they're the cream of the crop for modern day death metal, or you think they're overpraised and overrated, that's not the point I'm trying to make here. Because what Blood Incantation has done has struck a chord with a lot of metal fans, especially at least in the underground death metal scene. And I feel like the reason for that is their formula is looking at bands of the past, especially in the Floridian and Finnish death metal scene of the early 90s, and trying to bring that retro death metal sound to present day audiences, that it showcases that, again, as I stated, bands will always look at influences from years ago, things that you would think, oh, it's faded, it's gone, I'm too late to the party to enjoy this sound, and there will always be something in metal that I could name so many other bands or artists or inner circles, what have you, that have the same formula with all different genres and apply it to their sound. So again, it gives me the sense that it will always have reliability. You're never really too late to get into metal, regardless of the year or even your age, because dedication is a key component in it. On the other side of the spectrum, since metal is so vast and expansive, there's a lot of versatility with it. Versatility is a key ingredient to keeping music fresh and exciting, and metal's always doing that. Every time I think to myself, man, I've heard it all in extreme metal and metal itself, there's always a band taking influence from a completely different style of music that hell sometimes I don't even know exists, and applying it to all the wild and crazy subgenres you will find in metal, that it just seems to be like this melting pot of all different ways of sounds, textures, and experimentations that it feels almost in a sense endless. There are literally too many examples to name, but a few that come to mind would be Arcturus with their 1998 album Disguised Masters, where they blend their formula of extreme metal, elements of industrial, and forms of electronic, and even to an extent forms of trip hop was a big influence on this album, that it feels as if they took inspiration from early Massive Attack albums. Or look at a band like Disembowelment, a very highly respected extreme metal band that, yes, while they blended styles of death metal and doom metal together, what they're often praised for is their unique approach to it, with their strong usage of compositional work, ambience, and atmosphere that made it sound not only aggressive and heavy, but also lush at the same time. And when you look into their thank you notes on the album, they credited that some of their influences were the Koto twins and Enya. And in other circumstances, metal can find its way into influence for other styles of music. Even though this individual isn't trying to be a metal artist, a lot of you guys tend to want me to talk about this guy on my channel, but Sematary, with a lot of his mixtapes, he tends to find inspiration, at least with how he samples it, from black metal bands when creating this very harsh and abrasive rap music that he's often compared to that of Chief Keef, but just like the deep-fried version of him. That, yeah, you'll find samples on his work from bands like Pest and Life Lover. In short, there will be arguments about this that now there's no consistency with metal. If it's always changing and it doesn't have one distinct sound, where's the consistency? And this is where I feel like it falls back on what I just talked about earlier with its dedication. It's so vast, metal, that I feel like you'll have two separate worlds of bands and artists that want to just solely experiment with it, and others that want to keep its sound going for decades to come. And having these two pillars of ideas come forth in metal, I feel like it brings the best out in both of them to truly be more ambitious, which either side they tend to go on, thus just, again, bringing out more incredible music in metal. Another characteristic that I really like about metal that I don't really think is talked about all that much, but it gives it its own distinct charm, and that would be, honestly, its fashion. Not like you're ever going to see a metal fan on a runway anytime soon, but their fashion is very distinct. Whether it just be the very minimal, blue jeans, denim vest with patches, and a black t-shirt with an illegible logo on it, it still has distinct characteristics about it. That what I find so fascinating about metal subculture is that its fashion has stayed consistent basically since day one. Even all of the subgenres in metal, whether it be death, traditional, black, thrash, doom, and everything else, there's something still distinct about the fashion of each one of these subgenres. If you were to go to a festival dedicated to one of these genres, you're going to notice that a lot of the individuals attending that festival with their attire seems to be very similar. And while sure there are jokes about it online that it's just very cliche and you're not really going to see anything new or different about this fashion with these genres, it makes it feel a little bit more inviting really to anyone who at least knows what it is, because you get a sense of what you're getting yourself into. Speaking on behalf of my own personal bias, but even though the fashion sense, I guess, of metal is at times very simplistic of just black and white, I've always found it to just be very striking and eye-catching, from just the boldness and sharpness of the band logos you'll find on really any black t-shirt. I don't know what it is, but I've always been just attracted to the simplicity of it. Another inclusion that I really like about metal a lot, that I don't really expect many people to agree with me on this, not because it's a hot take, but I don't think many people think of it when talking about positives with metal is just the history of it. A part of me really wanted to include this because, for one, with my biased take, one of my favorite subjects in school was history. And with metal, you get a lot of history, regardless if it's a certain time, a certain place, a certain event, an album, an artist, a certain influence, or just really anything that's related to metal. Again, as I stated earlier, it's been around for over half a century. There are so many things to talk about in these like 50 plus years that it's been around. From metal's humble beginnings with bands like Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, to even what's considered to be proto-metal from bands of the late 60s that were before both Sabbath and Priest, that were kind of just like testing the waters of what metal was going to become when Sabbath and Priest would form, to decades later from all the bands that were influenced by either Black Sabbath or Judas Priest. Then you get to the 80s where thrash metal and more heavy metal bands were popping through, to the late 80s where death metal started becoming really rampant in the underground scene, to the early 90s where black metal was kind of being like this giant revolt against death metal, to the late 90s where bands were starting to become a lot more experimental and really pushing the boundaries of what really metal could do as a whole, to present day where it's kind of become like this giant melting pot of every style and thought that has been done or hasn't done, going back and forth. And all that being said is just glossing over the noticeable stuff. There are so many stories, there are so many different bands and styles that I didn't even talk about that made such an impact for metal that they have like their own significance to it, that you could honestly read so many different books and posts and, you know, interviews about the formation of just metal's history as a whole, and you're only scratching the surface. Again, maybe this is just my biased take of my interest with just history as a whole, but I feel like with this conversation about just metal's history as a whole, regardless of who you want to talk about, it starts a conversation with people. And it either leads you to different other recommendations, different other rabbit holes with the history of metal, that it's always kept me so interested with this style of music that only as of recently I've noticed this has just become, for me personally, a humongous reason as to why I've delved so many years listening to metal. And the final reason, which I know this is extremely cliche because everything I talked about can be wrapped under a bow under this one thing, but the one thing that metal just radiates so strongly is passion. From the bands, fans, labels, producers, news outlets, reviewers, bloggers, and even YouTubers, regardless of what I think of them, every single one radiates passion. Yes, it's an energy that you can find in really anything when people have a certain interest in anything. Yes, you will find it, but metal makes it just so obnoxiously known that it's impossible not to hear it or see it. And I feel like it's because of that one thing alone that they make it so upfront that no matter how much I try to deviate away from it or I might find interest in something else, a huge reason I've always had one of my feet just attached to metal no matter how much I try to get away from it is just the passion it radiates. It's impossible to ignore it. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Hopefully the last part I didn't come off too cheesy, which I know I kind of did, making it sound like we're all one big metal family, because that's not what I'm trying to say there. But again, I think you guys get the idea of just like the passion that metal radiates everywhere. But yeah, other than that, really nothing more else to say. Really curious to know what are things about metal that you like specifically, whether it be factual in some sense or just this unapologetic biased take. And other than that, like always, links provided to everything I talked about in this video in terms of the bands that were mentioned will be in the description below. Again, definitely check out Charlie Looker's channel. And that'll do it. So like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated and have a great day.